Zvuk misli.
Podcast Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju.
Dragi slušateljki, dragi slušalci, teoretski sladokusci, dobrodošli u drugu epizodu Zvuka misli, podcasta Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju. Šta se dešava danas u 21. veku sa pojmom subjekta, a šta sa pojmom istine? U drugoj polovini prošlog veka se činilo da su ovi pojmovi ispali sa radara teorije, onda kada su označeni od strane nekih struja postmodernizma i poststrukturalizma, kao deo taloga okoštale metafizičke tradicije. Međutim, danas izgleda da je pred nama neophodnost njihovog ponovnog promišljanja. Šta se može reći o ovim kanonskim pojmovima istorije filozofije, a da to ne bude ni puko ponavljanje, već poznatih teza, ni postavljanje temelja za jednu od novih brojnih ontologija. Na koji način možemo danas kritički govoriti o subjektu? Ili još bolje, šta možemo reći o savremenim transformacijama subjektivnosti u doba takozvane post-istine, u eri kada laž i istina, poverenje i nepoverenje, kriza i sigurnost se prepliću u nekoj vrsti hegelovske loše beskonačnosti? Koje kritičke alate za analizu ove situacije, ali i situiranje samog pojma subjekta nudi filozofija, a koja je psihoanaliza? Kada su oni komplementarni, a kada ne? Šta i danas možemo u subjektu istini da naučimo od Kanta ili Niča, a šta od Freuda ili Lacana? Koji uvidi ovih autora su, tako reći, primenljivi na današnji svet i njegovu novu normativnost? Šta o subjektu i subjektivnosti, a šta o istini i postistini ima da nam kaže naša današnja sagovornica Alenka Zupančič. Alenka Zupančič je čuvena slovenačka filozofkinja i teoretičarka psihoanalize, profesorka i istraživačica na Institutu za filozofiju Univerziteta u Novoj Gorici. Ona je takođe jedna od eminentnih figura ljubljanske škole psihoanalize, a piše i misli na okosnici psihoanalitičke teorije i kontinentalne filozofije, bavići se pre svega konceptima kao što su realno, ontologija, nesvesno, histerija, negiranje i negacija, laž, komedija, seksualnost, ali i mnogim drugim. Podsjećamo da su neki od njenih najpoznatijih naslova Ethics of Real, Kant and Lacan, The Odd One In, on Comedy, The Shortest Shadow, Nietzsche's Philosophy of the Two, i poslednji naslov What is Sex? Pre nego što pređemo na engleski, ako ja to već nisam uradio čitajući ove naslove, Alenka, dobar dan i dobrodošli u Zvuk misli. Hvala vam puno što ste danas sa nama, ovako jedino kako možemo, virtualno.
Veliko hvala na ovom pozivu. U čast mi je da danas razgovaramo ovde i u joy, u nadu, u radost. Ja razumem srpski dobro, ali govorim vrlo slabo, tako da nažalost odgovarat ću na engleskom. Nadam se da će i onako stvar dobro proći. Hvala.
Hvala puno vama, Alenka, tako da preći ćemo sada na engleski. So, one of the possible points of departure for our conversation today that will gravitate around the notions of subjectivity and truth is the current context that we're all living in. In that sense, Alenka Zupančič, how do you see the frequently used and often abused notion of post-truth? Is there anything new there? Or we are still dealing in a fashionable manner, maybe with the same old problems that were always amongst us?
I would say that it is certainly true that we are living or witnessing a certain shift, a certain real discursive shift that this term also tries to relate to. So perhaps the important thing is to determine what exactly is going on here. What is this, this shift that can be then prized or criticized? Because some say that it is very nice that we live in post-truth, that we have finally liberated ourselves from this tyranny of truth and so on. So I would say perhaps that regarding the shift that is happening, that one often points, and that is kind of encapsulated with the term post-truth, one often points finger at what appears, for instance, in our contemporary society as a kind of vulgar, generalized realization of postmodernism, you know, the decline of objective truth as epistemological category, as value, and so on.
Yes.
And then one goes on to kind of attribute the fact that, as we say, it is no longer possible to even distinguish truth from fiction. One has the tendency of attributing this to the influence of postmodern theory itself, or modern theory, or critical theory, and so on, or to this kind of movement of deconstruction of the notion of the original, and to kind of general promotion of nominalism and so on. But I think what one needs to be careful about here is that this enthusiasm of rediscovered realism, we see all kinds of realism popping up, that this enthusiasm of newly discovered realism sometimes tends to forget a very realistic fact that it is often quite objectively hard to distinguish truth from fiction.
Yeah.
Counterfeits, I don't know, all kinds of fakes are in fact getting better and better. I mean, obviously technology has produced some astonishing, disturbing even effects in this regard, but also our social relations in late capitalism are excessively, I would say, fictionalized in order for the real of the capital, for the reality of the capital to be able to follow its course. So we don't have like fiction on one hand and the real or reality on the other, but they are really in this case. So what I want to say is that it would seem that this kind of supposed postmodern questioning or undermining of the original has kind of long since moved to reality itself. It's not simply a question of theory or perspective, but of a certain way in which our reality is quite, I would say, objectively structured.
In that vein, I would like to mention an author that you cherish and that you have been working a lot during your career, and it is Nietzsche. So is there any possible relation between the so-called post-truth phenomenon that we're speaking right now and the infamous Nietzsche's dictum, which affirms that there is no truth, but only interpretations? The Nietzschean idea of truth is nuance, as you say.
Nietzsche and the question of truth is really an interesting and complex question. So I'm not even sure if we have the time and opportunity today to really dig into it in some detail, but concerning this dictum that you mentioned, there is no truth, only interpretations. I have to say that I'm not even sure if it does really describe the predominant social climate today.
Yes.
Namely, just let's think about what is on the rise. For instance, take the example of conspiracy theories, which are not only today, I would say, on the rise, but they also seem to be really forcefully entering the public space, the mainstream, even official politics. Obviously,
Sure.
Yeah, clear example, the relation between QAnon and Donald Trump and even mainstream Republican politics. So I think that while on the one hand, and you will see why I mentioned conspiracy theory, because on the one hand, we can say that this supposedly democratic relativization of or leveling of different claims, with scientific claims appearing as just one of many language games, that this is today problem, that appears as a problem, and that there is no public as a general common platform that would play the role of the big other.
What would you say on the phenomenon of cancel culture in that context?
If I can just, because I didn't even get to the point, what I was what I wanted to say is that in conspiracy theories, what is really interesting is that if you see how they function, their claim is not at all there are only truths, there are only interpretations, but no truths. They very much believe in truth. And they take the category of truth very seriously. So they're just convinced that the truth is different from the official one. So the paradigmatic theories are not there are many truths, but just we have to pick one or the other, but this kind of very, very almost fanatic truth, belief in truth. So my point was simply to say that in a different perspective, perhaps, the relativization of truth that we are witnessing today does not exactly present itself as a kind of playful, easygoing, postmodern dancing around, but often has precisely this kind of fanatic belief as its important ingredient. Yeah, so yeah, cancel culture, I guess it's yet another thing. It's not so much the question of fiction and truth as it is about a certain belief in the real that functions almost as a kind of preemptive strikes that will make impossible for certain statements, be it true or false, to appear at all. If this is what you were kind of
Yes. We will get to the topic of trust and mistrust a little bit later on, but I don't want to waste the opportunity to ask you about what do you think of the notion of lie and lying, because you were writing extensively on that subject, and you're insisting notably that on the fact that truth and lie are not symmetrical. So can you please say a few more words about that? And do you see the emancipatory potential in lie, maybe, or what do you read from its state today? What is lie today?
I think, I mean, I was right when I was writing about this. I did kind of take my starting point in this finally very simple notion of Lacan that truth and lie are not symmetrical because truth is kind of split or divided between two levels, and it is a kind of inherent condition of speech. In this sense, truth is more fundamental than lie, not in some moral sense or in some kind of theological sense, but simply because we don't get to say anything without at the same time positing that it is true. You know, the classic example, even if I say I'm lying, I am saying it is true that I am lying. So when I'm speaking, there is this dimension of truth that is not the opposite of falsehood, but that is a kind of a grounding both the truth as exactitude and lying. So, but then lying also has a very interesting dialectics of its own, because I would say that a lot of what we call lying springs, or this is what one calls the culture of lying, springs from an internal difficulty and contradiction of truth. You know, there is this famous saying by Lacan that truth is not all, that you cannot say it all. And there is something that you always say too much or not enough, or there is something that disappears there. So you have all these interesting phenomena which are like, you can lie with truth, or you can tell truth by means of a lie, which make the landscape much more interesting. But for me, this doesn't make it relative. I'm not saying it so it doesn't, it's not important whether we tell the truth or lie and so on. It's just saying that we have to be careful to detect, for instance, also the instances where you can very efficiently lie by just enumerating facts, certain facts, of course, not all of them, so that it makes sense to say, although everything that you said just now is true, factually true, nevertheless, your whole speech is a lie, or is there to kind of promote a certain way of social lie. And the other way around, you can also kind of do the opposite and use, or not like intentionally, but nevertheless use the lie. Through lying, you say a certain truth. So I think this is interesting also today, because it's not only about facts as much as I am for this kind of enlightenment idea that there is also a truth, a scientific truth that that has an extremely important weight.
We will see maybe if we are moving to that idea of truth via our paranoiac era, because when Lacan is speaking about paranoia, in the end, he's saying that it's a one step before the science in one of his seminars. But we are far away from that right now, I think. And let's focus now our attention, please, to the notion of subject. While keeping in mind, of course, the context that we have traced right now. And firstly, I will propose to you to grasp it from the psychoanalytic point of view, of course. It seems that in psychoanalytic theory, the Freudian one above all, the topos of censorship, the one that separates the conscious from the unconscious, and where the repression happens, is the pivotal place around which the subject is organized. In one of your interviews, Alenka Zupančič, you're mapping the affect, which is the specific translation and the conscious counterpart, so to say, of the unconscious drive, as a socially valorized category nowadays. In that vein, do you think that censorship and the whole mechanism of repression has changed, has loosened up in some perverse way? Has it become more porous, so to say? Or to put this differently, has the role of censorship and the repression in subjectivity changed from the times when, for example, Freud or Lacan even used to write about it?
Yeah, to some extent, it definitely did change. Also, I think we should be careful to see precisely what is going on here. If it's just kind of censorship becoming less severe, or is it that something that the censorship is structured, its modality is structured in a different way, which precisely includes some way of acknowledging what we know as a way of perpetuating the repression, the Verdrängung, the unconscious. And I think, I don't know, I can go there directly, or you want me first to answer this more general question about the Lacanian subject, what is it, the Lacanian subject, or we go first to interrogate a little bit, what are these specific modalities of repression today?
Let's start from the subject, if that's fine with you. That would be maybe a good ground for understanding repression as its kind of mechanism that is inherent to the subject. So please, yes, we can start with the subject.
Yeah, I think what is really interesting and quite kind of unique in Lacanian theory, and this is why I like it so much, is that differently from most of these other, let's say, post-structuralist theories and so on, which more or less, I'm simplifying a little bit, but still hold that the subject is simply an effect of the structure, that is to say, of some fundamentally non-subjective process. And as such, we can more or less do without it, without this notion. in Lacan, there is a big difference. It's not simply the subject is the effect of the structure. It is actually the name of the lack or contradiction or gap in this structure. So the idea is quite different. And this means that subject, it's not exactly the same as subjectivation, as this kind of richness of life experiences, the way in which we subjectify certain things. So it is, I think, also politically important point that subject corresponds to a gap in the symbolic structure, or to put it this way, that it points to the fact that the symbolic or discursive structure is not simply consistent or all. If it were consistent of all, then it wouldn't even produce, we wouldn't need the notion of the subject. But this is not how Lacan poses it. Okay, then this notion of the subject as basically a lack in the other also introduces a kind of more complex landscape concerning the question of repression. Verdrängung, the repression in this Freudian sense of Verdrängung, a kind of redoubling, namely, if subject is this ontological lack or inconsistency of the symbolic other, it is not only the one who represses certain things, but it also like structurally the place where the repression happens, and also the place where the symptoms of this repression surface or emerge. So Freud, I think, saw this or intuited this. He doesn't have an explicit theory about as Lacan does, but he intuited this, and this is why I think he introduced this term of Urverdrängung, you know, the primal repression, which is a kind of, the idea is that the repression doesn't start with the first thing you repress, but it is kind of built in, the unconscious is built in as a negativity in the very symbolic structure. So it's not directly personal. So, and just one more important point that I think relates to this is why, for instance, Lacan can say that formations such as society in general or family or this or that institutions, these are not simply formations that induce a repression, that demand repression, as in this kind of classical Freudian understanding, but are actually creations built on repression and with repression, with Verdrängung. So they're struggling themselves with an inherent gap that determines with an inherent impossibility. And I think this is very important. Yes. So when it is important also to kind of keep that in mind when we move then to your second, to the second part of your question, which is what has changed lately in this way in which in which these structures try to keep the antagonism or their inherent possibility repressed or out of sight, so to say. I think one of the ways which is becoming absolutely predominant, you know, what you said, that is it diminishing the censorship? Freud already introduced two ways in which repression is being sustained by means of us fully consciously declaring the very thing that is repressed. You know, one well-known example is from Verneinung paper, you know, when the analysant says, without even being asked this question, oh, I had this dream, there was this person in it, I don't know who this person was, but it surely was not my mother. You know, this is the way you pronounce it, you say mother, it is there in front of your eyes, but it is a way of precisely not seeing what you say. I mean, it's, but the other, which is even more relevant, I guess, for our present social, for the way in the repression functions in this social way and stage, is the case of fetishist disavowal. You know, this famous, I know very well.
Words about that concept, please, because it
sounds...
really important for
yeah, I think it's really important, and it has this kind of perverse distortion in it, which I think it's extremely important for the way our relationship to what is going on functions, and our unconscious can be sustained. So it is the basic structure of fetishist disavowal is, you know, this saying, I know very well that this is so and so, but somehow I keep believing that it is not so, or I believe the opposite, or still believe it. And I would really say that this is a kind of predominant mode of how today very often huge or quite problematic forms of repression are being sustained by us, or sometimes by some leaders or whatever, kind of shamefully displaying and blatantly stating what is there, but nothing follows from there, you know. So there we all know, no? Very often we hear this formula, but we all know what is going on, and it seems that as if this knowledge itself was a way of protecting us from acknowledging the consequences of this knowledge. So here this perhaps becomes a little bit more complicated, but I will try to explain how I think what is happening here. So we have a kind of structure of the fetishist disavowal, je sais bien mais quand même, but there is a further twist in it. So it is no longer simply, I know very well that there is no X, but I keep believing there is. But actually it is now as if that I know very well that there is no X, and this is precisely, I can go on believing in it. As if this knowledge were enough and justified my actually, as if it robbed this knowledge of all consequences, because it is enough that we know. So while in the classic fetishist constellation, the disbelief, the unconscious belief is kind of delegated to the fetish. You know, the fetishist is, it's not that I know very well, for instance, I know very well, this is the Freudian example, that women don't have a penis. But it is not that, but I secretly believe that they nevertheless do. It is the fetish that believes this in my stead. It is the shoe, whatever, it is, the belief is delegated to the fetish. And my point would be that what is going on today is that the knowledge itself functions also as this kind of fetish. So this kind of precipitated knowledge, the awareness of how things really stand, we know realistically how they are, makes it possible for us to ignore what we know. So it is not, I know very well, but I nevertheless continue to believe the opposite, but rather, as I said, I know very well, and this is why I can go on ignoring it, or it can stay in this way. So it is, and I think it's really kind of blatant if you look at how very often some things that is suddenly revealed and it looks like a total scandal is then immediately transformed into this kind of general consensus. Oh, but we knew this all along. You know, it's nothing. And this is quite interesting for me. And this is for me the fetishization of knowledge, not in the sense that knowledge is so important in this common sense of fetishization, but precisely in the Freudian sense, knowledge itself is this fetish, this object, this shoe that kind of takes on the suppressed or verdrängt belief that it is actually not true. So we are, and so this is interesting because it looks that it is not simply that everything is out on the open. This would be my point regarding your question, that now the censorship has diminished, but the modality, the form of censorship and of keeping things unconscious, profoundly unconscious, has changed. And the fact that they're right there in front of our eyes, it's not necessarily an indicator that the censorship is no longer there. It just means that it uses another means of being effective. So I think there is still a lot of repression and censorship going on, but that it had found this kind of perfidious, perverse form that is very very connected to fetishism.
Yes, you were mentioning when bringing closer to us all that conceptual apparatus. You were mentioning words like belief and trust and the perfidious way in which all functions. How do you see the notion of trust and belief? Have this what you have been talking about? Can that signify the final takeover of trust? Actually, it's form that has become so predominant that it is dictating the real in some sense.
In what I was just saying, this kind of combination of knowledge, we know all about it. We are nobody's dupes. This is also an important. We are no fools. We know this seems to be a very strong motivation in this knowledge functioning as the fetish here in this precise Freudian sense. But I think what is interesting precisely in this configuration is also the kind of coincidence, I would even say, of trust and mistrust. So, that there is a very interesting way in which the mistrust is the very form of trust.
I mean, just with the negation in front, so it's even more richer in some sense. It's not some kind of a sublated trust, if you want. It's only opposite, which is identical opposite.
Precisely, and here again, if you return to the example that I suggested earlier, a very good example of this is precisely again conspiracy theories. Where you have this kind of clear coincidence of absolutely mistrust or paranoid mistrust towards all kinds of things, particularly official versions of events, authorities, and so on. But at the same time, also this incredible trust or belief in whatever, not only in the theory that they are proposing, but also I would say that this combination of trust and mistrust is kind of, or coincidence of trust and mistrust is kind of part of the very form of what we could say is the conspiracy theorist big other, if you use this kind of Lacanian, because Lacanian concept, because conspiracy theories have a very, very interesting relation to this agency that Lacan calls the big other. Namely, on the one hand, they believe, they are convinced that a big other actually very much exists, differently from what Lacan says. They believe that it exists in the sense that they believe that there is an agency which is in itself absolutely consistent, operates purposefully, pulls all the strings, and there is no lack or gap in this agency. It is absolutely consistent. So in this sense, they believe that the big other, not divided or exists. So this is the level of certainty, of trust, if you want. They trust here, big other. But at the same time, they can only trust this big other if they cast it as fundamentally and deliberately deceiving. So it is very interesting that it seems that the consistency, the big other is not barred in any way. It is a consistent big other, but it can only be, as a big other, it can only be a big deceiver with capital D, a big fraud, a big cheat. So don't believe anything they say. But you see how there is a very interesting interplay, again, of trust and mistrust, and how the very mistrust, the radicality of mistrust, is founded in this absolute trust that they know what they're doing, and they have everything under control, and they're pulling all the strings. So I think this is quite quite interesting as a way in which many things today work, and we sometimes think that, that there is this radical skepticism, this radical criticism, but if you look at these structures more closely, you see how the skepticism is not at all very radical, not radical enough, that it actually is based on some kind of certainty which is which sustains it.
Yes, let's stay that like raises many topics that I would like to ask you, but let's stay on the maybe a little bit more on the notion of mistrust, Unglauben, which is so important for Freud and Lacan, and of course in relation to denial, which we were mentioning already. And in all of that, in the context of the global rise of right-wing populists, so to say, ideologies that seem all to rely heavily, with the conspiracy theories and everything around it, on popular mistrust. So is, on the one hand, is denial the Verneinung? Is it the new predominant type of repression? And so, and we have touched on the subject that trust is in some way definitely replaced by mistrust as a constitutive feature of reactionary subjectivity. One question that would underline the first two ones would be, if we used to live in neurotic times, are we living now in a deeply paranoid era?
I mean, one thing that one perhaps needs to say nevertheless is that this mistrust, it's not simply, I wouldn't simply define it as a kind of a necessarily reactionary or pathological formation, or is it is just pathological, it is pathological in the sense, or to the extent to which also points to some pathology of the way our society functions today. I mean, not because of these people being paranoid, but because there is something in the very structuring of the social order that kind of not only induces, but we could perhaps even say justifies a certain paranoid attitude. So it is not simply that, okay, they are paranoid, so they're crazy, forget. There is a certain truth if we return, go back to what we were talking about in relationship to truth and lying. We could say that there is a certain higher or more general truth involved in this very paranoid reaction of the masses, if you want. So something points to a real problem in the social bond and in the way it is structured these days. So it is, and I'm not only talking about this kind of conditions of everything, including work conditions and so on, becoming more and more precarious, of this instability of this or that, all these things, and the way in which we are precisely trained, ideologically trained, to not rely too much on anything or anybody, because then we are not flexible enough to satisfy whatever contemporary era and so on. So there is certainly a lot going on. This is also why I don't think that we should also simply dismiss these movements, including the most reactionary one, as wrong. Of course, they are wrong. They are wrong in most of what they are saying, but there is a certain truth that pertains to the reasons of why and how they emerged in this particular point in time, in history, in social relations. So this would be definitely something that we have to bear in mind. So I wouldn't even, I mean, a reactionary subject, I mean, it's not a justification, it's just that we need to keep the two levels of truth and of the lie or falsehood in front of our eyes, in order not to fall prey too quickly of some kind of moralizing discourse of outrage and condemnation, you know, because there are certain reasons for this which are not like direct psychological reasons, but are related to certain social structuring. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. Maybe we should go now to one of your early books entitled Ethics of Real, Kant and Lacan. And in one of the first chapters in that book is named The Subject of Freedom. In this text, you're developing a very complex argument that links the Kant's notion of subject to the one that was developed in Lacan. And the central position in this text is taken by a Freud's dictum that goes like this. I must read it. Man is not only much more unfree than he believes, but also much freer than he knows. This is going, I think, well with what we were talking to right now. So could you tell us what are, in your view, maybe some emancipatory features of Kant's, but also on the other side, Lacan's conceptions of subjectivity in the context that we were mentioning?
This is an extremely important question today, precisely because it tackles this question of freedom, and it tries to tackle it in a way that is very different from all this talk about freedom that we are that is a kind of ideological food of the functioning basically of capitalism, neoliberalism, and so on, which is the freedom of choice. I mean, the word freedom has been so much used that it no longer has any emancipatory ring to it. It also always, I mean, not always, but almost seems that it's become the very signifier of oppression. You know, you do all kinds of things in the name also of freedom, democracy, or whatever. So it is very, very important, I guess, to also philosophically try to pin out what are we talking about when we're talking about freedom. Is this simply some kind of subjective freedom or so on? So this is why, for me, the Kantian approach in its very radicality was interesting because it, on the one hand, it absolutely includes this kind of belief in causality and causal determination, but nevertheless points at the possibility of freedom, which is not the opposite simply of this causal determination. So in relation to this saying, if I put it very simply, what that you were quoting, I think we could perhaps, for the purposes of this discussion, related to what I was saying earlier, namely when I said that the subject is the lack in the structure or the lack in the other. So we could say that the first part of this saying, this man is not only much more unfree than he believes, that this first part kind of confronts us with ways in which we are being determined by different structure, by the symbolic order, by the discursive order, and so on. So we certainly are determined. The freedom is not to be looked for when, okay, but here we are not determined. I mean, we are completely determined. But the second part, but we are also much freer than we know, refers to what I was saying before about this structure of causal determination being in itself, involving in itself a moment of inconsistency or lack, which is not simply to say, okay, here there is no causal determination, there is, but it is constructed in a certain way which involves a certain gap. Okay, you can also say that causality, the notion of causality as such, always involves a gap, that it is not the same as the law, you know, of action and counteraction, where the two actions are actually two sides of the same thing, but that cause, or there is a gap, and this is a famous dictum by Lacan, when he says that there is only the cause of something that doesn't work completely smoothly. You know, that there is a certain, in order for the cause to be a cause, there is a lapse through which it is determined or it is decided that it is a cause or something like that. Okay, not to complicate things too much, we could say that the other of causal determination in this sense does not fully cover its own field. So not that it is there absent or something. That so freedom of the subject does not mean that then the subject can overrun causal determination or act against it in some kind of ecstatic act. It means that causal determination itself involves a kind of internal blind spot, and the name of this blind spot is the subject. This is all it means. It doesn't refer to some, I don't know, act of I don't know what kind of freedom. So it is interesting because this suggests that subject precisely is not the opposite of structure, some kind of autonomous agent or power external to the structure, but the name of the inconsistency of this structure, which has this this thing built into it, so to say. So, and one more thing, because there was a lot of contemporary theory that emphasized also this kind of omnipotence of the other, of power and so on. And I think this is interesting in this context as well. It has political implications. For instance, we can say, of course, the power of the other, of the discursive, whatever, can be seen as very paralyzing for human agents compared to our power. But the claim is, but nevertheless, it is not without contradictions. It has weak points. But on the other hand, for instance, if you think of this notion of micropower, which was kind of very popular, fashionable at some point, I think this notion is symptomatic because it is kind of, if it suggests, contrary to what Lacan is saying, it suggests this idea of a closed, uninterrupted continuum of consistency. You know, micropower basically means that power exists or is filling in every pore of our social tissue. So almost like there is no lack in this other. There is no consistency. And so and this is the difference. It's, of course, if you say there is inconsistency, this does not imply any direct freedom. But it is a point when things happen. When things happen, and when things happen that open up a certain space of difference, or of difference that makes a difference, and of things that can perhaps be changed in this sense. So the Lacanian point is simply that there is no this kind of uninterrupted continuum of the other's consistency, but not that the other is not, it's the power, sometimes the powers are all the more violent. They act all the more aggressively and abandonedly when precisely this weak point is at stake. So this is not to say that they are simply weak, no, not at all, but this is something to be taken into account.
Yes.
Does this make sense? I mean,
of course, but let's make a huge leap right now and go to your latest book as we are approaching the end of this episode of the podcast of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, Sound of Thoughts. And not so inconsistently, maybe we already gave something to something that we will recognize your signature in it. In your latest book, entitled "What is Sex?", you claim that sexuality is the point of the short circuit between ontology and epistemology. Is sex, with all its ontological gaps and contradictions, and with the knowledge that it transmits and that you're pointing at, resisting somehow to the register of the so-called post-truth. What is inevitably true in, or rather around, sex? Alenka Zupančič.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah. So, okay, the project behind this book was kind of a really big project to trying to take sexuality precisely as not simply something trivial, not in the sense that it is meaningful or important, but in the sense that it could be taken as the place out of which precisely all this kind that is related to all kinds of contradictions and difficulties, and that it has this kind of intrinsic impossibility built into itself. So this is why I thought it was important to make this investigation of sexuality, an ontological investigation, and not simply an investigation of different sexual practices, habits, gender studies, and so on. And obviously the result, and I really like this comment, something that I heard many times when I was kind of presenting the book, was that, okay, but you know, you took all the joy out of sex, you know. But I guess this is what the book actually aimed at. Not that we should no longer enjoy sex, but this is precisely not the point. It is to take it as precisely that which fits all kinds of meanings and stuff, but to show why and how is why is this so and how. So the subject of my inquiry was the concept of sexuality as proposed and existing in psychoanalysis, particularly Freud and Lacan, and not what is called sexual practices. So I insist on this notion of, on this term concept. And precisely as a concept, sexuality is very much related, on the one hand, to this what we were discussing earlier as this negativity or lack of the structure or in the structure. So we can say that sexuality stands with one foot in the lack or negativity, in the minus that defines for Freud the topology of the unconscious, but it also stands with its other foot in a surplus. Enjoyment, a surplus, as always something not simply that we want, but on top even of what we want. So that this notion of the surplus and of minus, as I try to show, are precisely intrinsically related in sexuality, and they constitute like two faces of the same surface, the surface that we could also call the subject. But okay, here I focus more on the structure of the drives and so on. So, but if I take now from another and more kind of perhaps popular angle, this question of sex and post-truth or sex, or what you ask, what is true around sex, I would say, first of all, that sex is not the ultimate truth of anything. It is this kind of sad and unfortunate misunderstanding of Freud. Freud doesn't say that the sex is the ultimate truth of anything. Rather, he says that sex, in the broader sense of sexuality, in its very ontological inconsistency, difficulty, and so on, is what throws us kind of out of joint, out of self-absorption, and makes us precisely curious about things, about others, about truth, opens us to even the most metaphysical questions. This is what is interesting in the point that psychoanalysis is making. It's not that it reduces all the high thoughts and metaphysical issues to sexuality as the bottom line. It is also that it shows how the sexuality itself is already a highly metaphysical question itself. So it's not the question of debasing, these high ideas in philosophy to say, but this is just all about sex, and so this is the truth. No, the opposite is really interesting for me in psychoanalysis, how it actually shows how if you look at the sexuality, you also already see in display, or you can take out of it the very template of the most metaphysical question. So it is here. I think I don't know. We could say that I'm really truly Freudian in this respect. I think that sexuality does drive the quest for knowledge, does drive the quest for truth. And that there is no simply original drive for knowledge as such. So this is the Freudian statement.
All those are very compelling theses. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah. I think it's, but in the sense of it's not driving the quest for truth in the sense of being the true motive behind this quest, but precisely as its internal drive. There is something, as I said, there is something sexual in the very drive for knowledge. It is not that they are, this is for me the revolutionary thinking about sexuality of Freud, not that it is some substance to which we can attribute or relate or other substances, but that it's the inherent negativity of all these other substances, or also epistemologically. So in this sense, curiosity, even if you take this example when children play, even if they are very small children, curiosity for them is not simply about learning how the world is, but also about seeing how the other, their partner there, will react to this question. Will she blush? What will happen?
Sure.
Does the other really know? I mean, this already involves something, and I would simply say that the sexuality is, there is sexuality in truth and in its pursuit. So perhaps to turn your question the other way around, we could say that it is not so much the question what is true in or around sex, but about how sex is implicated in truth, how this drive is implicated in truth, where the sex stands in truth, in the very configuration of truth. But does this implication of sexuality in truth make truth any less valid? No, I don't think so. I don't think this is simply a relativization. It makes truth more interesting and a more kind of complex notion. And just one more thing relating to this post-truth. I mean, post-truth, if there is such thing, it looks for me like a kind of indifference. But at the same time, I'm kind of strongly convinced that one cannot really be indifferent to truth. I'm not even sure this is possible. We can repress it, but this is not the same thing. And moreover, I really don't see indifference as a predominant affect today. I mean, passions are rising all around us, more than disappearing. And the problem is rather that I think that truths are becoming extremely or almost exclusively personal, and everybody has a personal big other, rather than common, rather than shared. So the social dimension of truth is definitely seems to be weakening. And yeah, this has to do with a lot of things, but it's not, I don't think the truth as such, or even this passion to get to it is disappearing, but it is structuring in a very different way, and this social link, the way in which it is weakening, this is surely not good news, because then it is open to some kind of sometimes very problematic ways of secondary bounding, which we know from history also as not being particularly very fortunate.
Thank you so much for all of your compelling theses that you have exposed today with us, Alenka Zupančič. Just one last very brief question, maybe a general one. What are the challenges of philosophy and theory, the psychoanalytic one maybe in the first place today? And how is theory engaged today in the social realm? What made you start writing theory, and what makes you keep dealing with it? Just very brief for the end for our listeners.
very briefly, I'm not sure what made me start making writing theory. I don't think I can answer this directly. Definitely some kind of drive to do it. But just perhaps two very brief remarks on this question. What is the, I think philosophy and also psychoanalytic theory is always engaged in the social realm. It's not existing somewhere else. But I don't think it works, or it should work by way of prescribing to reality that it should change or how it should change. I don't think this is where its power and its strength lies, because this would not only be kind of presumptuous, precisely because we are part of this reality, but also I think it could block the real change, because these kind of prescriptions, you know, this is wrong, we should do this and that, these prescriptions are always based upon the present configuration, and they are not taking into account precisely the possibility of a radical change, which also would mean to change the very parameters of our present configuration. If we just talk from our present perspective, we can miss a lot, and we can close up our attunement to certain kind of possibilities. So I think philosophy, or also psychoanalysis, basically asks, why is reality such as it is? Not in order to justify it, but precisely to see what internal contradictions it harbors, and what internal contradictions it tries to accommodate or obfuscate or repress, and how, by what means. And I think if it does this, it already does a lot. I think this is a lot, to have a means of relating to these contradictions.
Thank you so much. It's a perfect place where we will stop now, and I would like to thank you in front of the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory from the University of Belgrade. It was very interesting. It was compelling, and I thank you once more. I hope to see you once also in Belgrade. It will be really a great joy for us. We will we will see the circumstances, and then we will most surely continue. Thank you so much for this conversation, and yes, that was the second episode of Sound of Thoughts, the podcast of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. Thank you, Alenka Zupančič.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I hope it makes some sense what I said.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.